Hello and welcome to What Would Jane Do? And today I'm joined by my usual podcast partner, Katie McFarlane, who, if you are watching this, is splendidly dressed in her best bonnet and blue. But very excitingly, I think we almost could do with a drum roll here. We have a very special guest. Her name is Caroline Knight.
Caroline Jane Knight.
Yeah, the Jane bit is important, as you'll see in a moment, because Caroline has joined us. She lives in Australia normally, but she's with us today in the UK. But what you all want to know is that she is a descendant of Jane Austen's family and very much involved in the family curation of the Jane Austen legacy. So, in honour of Caroline's presence with us today, we thought we would choose as our theme, what would Jane do about Who Do You Think You Are? Probably most of you have seen that programme where celebrities dig into their past, and sometimes you find you're connected to a king and other times to a convict. That's how history goes. But Caroline knows exactly who she's connected to. So, Caroline, why don't you help us situate you on the family tree? We know obviously that Jane didn't have any children of her own. So where are you? Who do you relate to?
Well, thank you. First of all, thank you very much for having me. Very nice to be with you here. So, as you say, Jane had no children of her own, so there are no direct descendants. So we're all collateral descendants. And I am a descendant of Edward Austen's. And Edward Austen was Jane's older brother, who I'm sure everybody knows, was chosen by the Knight family to be the heir of the Knight estates, because Thomas and Catherine at the end of the 18th century didn't have any heirs. And actually, in the history of Chawton House, which was built, the build started around 1585 by John Knight. I'm 17th generation Knight, and in that history, there's actually been 50% of the time, about just under 50% of the time, where the squire hasn't had an heir. It happened quite a lot. Of course, because we're talking about days before fertility treatment. So people, of course, tended to have a lot or none. And there's quite a lot of that in our family. And in that circumstance, if there is no heir, because you have to have one, a cousin or a nephew or certainly a relation is chosen. And at the end of the 18th century, as I say, Thomas and Catherine, childless, chose Edward Austen. The Knights and the Austens were distant cousins, fourth cousins. I say distant by our yes. Today. I mean, of course, in those days, fourth cousin, people knew their wider family. So Edward Austen was chosen. And when he inherited the Chawton estate, Godmersham Park in Kent, and Steventon, which was Jane's, obviously, childhood home. And Jane spent the last sort of 8-9 years of her life in Chawton. And I'm, as I said, a direct descendant of Edward's. So I am just lucky enough that I am the descendant of, the heir line. So when I was born, my grandfather, who was Edward Knight III, which I have to say, of course, we didn't call him that. Black ops. But history, because there were three of them, history calls him Edward Knight III. So he was my grandfather and the squire of Chawton when I was born, and I was lucky enough to grow up there. So Chawton House was my childhood home till I was 18. So that's how I sort of fit into the family tree. So Jane is my fifth great aunt.
Thank you. That sounds magical. And the story about Edward always does seem a bit like something out of a fairy tale. The child chosen, picked on to be whisked off to this world of far greater wealth and landed gentry, whereas obviously Jane and her brothers and sisters stayed within the upper middle class world of the rectory. Though of course her brothers, the ones who went into the navy, did very extremely successful. Yes, did extremely well. So they're more of a sort of self-made success. Yes. Whereas Edward had this extraordinary translocation. And if you're looking for a comparison within Jane's own novels, of course, it's a bit like Frank in Emma, who has that experience of being adopted by somebody else outside the direct family line.
Absolutely. Although by all accounts, Edward was chosen because, of course, when you're choosing an heir, you're choosing the CEO to carry on the family business. Yeah. And he was chosen because even at a young age, they felt he had the right personality and had the right, temperament to do it. And by all accounts, he was a good squire, both in terms of his abilities at running the estates, but also, the records tell us that Edward was a caring squire. He looked after the people in the parish. He paid for schoolmistresses for Chawton and for Steventon. That he didn't have to, but he certainly, as I said, by all accounts, was a very effective and caring squire.
It's lovely to hear that he was continued interest in education, because of course his own father was a teacher, and
exactly.
They were a very bookish family, shall we say. So before we sort of go on to the present day issue of looking after the Jane Austen heritage, which is really the main reason we've asked you to come along, I'm interested to find out what you think about the whole idea of breeding in Jane's world and how she writes about it. So, for example, were the Knight family particularly proud of their own family going back before that generation? Is the house stuffed full of pictures of, the ancestors?
Absolutely. So, of course, with many squires coming, before I was born, the house is full of portraits. And there's plenty of ancestors that that are notable and that we're proud of. One notable would be Sir Richard Knight, whose sort of marble effigy reclines today in Chawton Church. So he's been in Chawton Church for over 300 years. When was he? Was he 300 years ago? Early 17th. Early 17th century. And he actually, if it wasn't for him, Chawton House may not be standing today.
Right.
Because when Oliver Cromwell's men came from France to overthrow the king, they came through Chawton. And they were coming through England, and they were challenging the squires as they went to pledge allegiance to Oliver Cromwell and not to the king, which of course many of them wouldn't do. But as a result, their houses were destroyed. They were torn down by Cromwell's army. Luckily for us, Richard had just inherited, and he was only 2 years old. And they knocked on the door of Chawton House, but he was obviously too young to swear allegiance to anybody. And so they carried on going and left.
Well, come back later.
Yeah, exactly. Which was just absolutely fantastic. But then Richard had his childhood officially with no Christmas, because Cromwell, Puritans obviously got rid of that. So it's a family tradition, which I don't know how long it's been going on, but I assume for centuries, because it's certainly been in living memory of anybody that's alive today, that actually every Christmas we go to the church and we put holly in Sir Richard's hand of his statue, so that he doesn't miss any more Christmases, because he would have, as I said, missed it as a child. And I'm sure, Jane would have known about that. We also have the only female squire we ever had, who was Elizabeth. She was Martin, but when the house is passed from different branches of the family, as I said, for the purposes of heirs, it's always on the condition that if your name isn't Knight anyway, you change it to Knight, which is obviously why Edward changed his name from Austen to Knight, which gives the illusion that we're all, a direct sort of bloodline, and we're not, but it gives that sort of illusion. And certainly Fanny Knight, Edward's eldest daughter, she writes in her diaries about what fun they're having looking through the family archives at Chawton House, learning about, the more colourful ancestors. So certainly, yes, for us, I mean, of course, Jane is of course, she's the most famous of the family. But certainly we absolutely celebrate our the lineage of Chawton House, should I say, all the way back to 1588. And in actual fact, the Knights were first recorded in Chawton at the beginning of the 14th century. So there's a very long history there.
So one of the interesting things for a Jane Austen reader, of course, is that the Knight family were, in a way, the people who gave Jane access to a class that she wouldn't normally be spending much time with. She'd see them passing by, maybe in church occasionally, but she wouldn't spend holidays with them or, rub shoulders on a social level. And when you look at the aristocracy in her books, she isn't shy at poking fun at them, is she?
No.
So is there any whispers in the family about any models for Lady Catherine de Bourgh or
well,
any of those characters?
I mean, obviously we all have to be very, very careful about trying to suggest that any particular person is any particular person. But certainly, so as I said, in our history, we have one female squire. Elizabeth, who was at sort of the early part of the 17th century, or in the 17th century. Sorry, I'm now my brain's doubting me on the dates. I get them all mixed up. No, she was early 18th century, so I'm a century out. She's early 18th century.
Easily done.
She was squire while Queen Anne was on the throne.
Yeah, that's right.
We're in early 18th century. Yeah. And by all accounts, now it would have been very unusual to be a female squire then. So maybe some of her behaviour was necessary in order to assert her authority and be taken seriously. But she certainly, by all accounts, was a woman who was very proud of her own station, as it were, and used to do things like insist that the bells of the church were rung when she left and arrived at the estate. No one else ever did that.
Marvellous.
You know, and she ran the estate herself, though. She had 2 husbands, both of which had to change their name to Knight, not the other way around.
And not at the same time.
Not at the same time. Not at the same time. The second husband, and there's stained glass windows in Chawton House that depict all of the squires and what their arms were, and so their names and the husband's names are underneath. And her second husband was called Bulstrode Peachy Knight.
Oh, wonderful name!
Which is just such a good name, isn't it? Such a good name. But as I said, she, you know, lots of her, you know, letters to stewards and things like that have survived and are in Hampshire archives. And certainly she comes across as a very forthright, you know, very forthright woman. So I certainly think she had shades of Catherine de Bourgh.
Yeah. I mean, right. there is that reading of Catherine de Bourgh. I expect someone will write a novel about it, where you actually think of her as a, like you mentioned, a CEO, where she actually is like this in order to whip all these ridiculous men into line. Because if you're dealing with a big estate like that, you are responsible for the lives of people, so you need to check their closets are okay. And
as I said, and maybe in those days, as a woman, to be taken seriously, it was necessary to have that. I mean, my own grandmother at Chawton House, who I mean, as a grandmother, was absolutely loving, and I love Granny very, very dearly. And she wasn't anything like Catherine de Bourgh, but you know, in character, she wasn't. You know, she didn't sort of have the, you know. had I known how to play, I would have been enormously. She wasn't that sort of woman at all, but she had an air about her. My grandmother just had an air of authority that even the bravest wouldn't have challenged Granny. If she said something was going to happen, it was going to happen, and she gave no explanation, and you wouldn't have dared sort of ask why she, you know, or what she felt about something, or what she, you know, she had an air. And yes, I think that was probably necessary, as you say, to be taken seriously in running an estate like that.
So when Jane's thinking about her own family, it does seem as though some of her musings about it do come into her writings a little bit. So, for example, it can't be an accident that one of her most perfect, in a sense, heroes is Mr. Knightley. You're not going to choose the name Knightley sitting at the end of the road to Knight, are you?
Exactly. Absolutely. And certainly, I mean, Emma was the first novel that I knew as a child, obviously because of that connection. And not only, and as you said, it can't be a coincidence that he's called Knightley. It just can't be. I mean, you know, it can't be. She was living in Chawton, then it was obviously completely conceived in Chawton, as opposed to Sense and Sensibility and Pride and Prejudice, which were obviously conceived, you know, in Steventon. And as you said, Knightley, actually, for one of her heroes, is surprisingly faultless, isn't he?
Yeah.
I mean, you know, yes.
I mean, he may be a little bit, it comes across as a touch humorless from Emma's point of view for a bit, and then he sort of mellows, but that's his journey. But he's not learning to appreciate someone like Elizabeth, like the Darcy journey. You know, it's not as much as that. And of course, in Mansfield Park, you've got, always get Edwards and Edmonds all mixed up, but you know, he has to fall out of love with Mary Crawford and realize the Sterling, you know, he's a bigger journey, and so on. So any other little traces of her own family in her works that we may have missed, that you know of, that the family say, ah, yes?
Not specifically in terms of being able to say that we think this particular person may have influenced any particular character. in terms of family. But one thing that's quite interesting, which is that this isn't an influence on Jane's work, because it happened afterwards, actually, just afterwards. But certainly we have stories in the family of things that were very reminiscent of what was going on in her stories, which actually just show that her stories were a real representation of the sorts of things that did go on. Yeah. So a good example of that would be that Edward Austen's son, Edward II, obviously Edward Knight at that point, he eloped to Gretna Green with Lord Knatchbull's daughter, to an enormous scandal, to the point that Lord Knatchbull's daughter didn't talk to her for years afterwards, absolutely cut her off. So there are stories that certainly make you think of, I mean, obviously that's a Wickham, that's a Wickham story. So as I said, that did happen afterwards. So that's certainly not where that came from. But it's certainly just, there are stories that are a demonstration of the fact that Jane, of course, wasn't just making it up. This really was the sort of thing that went on.
If they had read Pride and Prejudice, I think they took the wrong lesson from it.
Exactly.
Just saying, the pain for the family.
Exactly.
Okay, so obviously we're all aware of the class system around in Jane's time and what she might have done tracing her family further back. Now let's go to you and the issue you have about who do you think you are up at Chawton itself, because keeping alive a house, a library, a literary legacy, that's a massive job. Most of us have got a box of photographs and papers somewhere, and you've got much more than that. And I'm aware that you're here because of the responsibilities you have to the family. Would you like to tell us how about what's going on and also where we can help?
So I think you're right, of course, having, being part of Jane's family, that does certainly for me comes with a sense of responsibility for her legacy. However, Jane's legacy, if you like, I mean, Jane is owned by everybody, she's owned by absolutely everybody. And there are, and her legacy is very well preserved by Jane Austen's house. And when I was a child, we actually ran a tea room from the front of Chawton House, from the Great Hall at Chawton House, which as an adult looking back must have been to try and get some income into the house, because whilst I grew up in, yes, an incredible, I don't know how many bedrooms it would have had originally, but when we lived there, certainly 20 plus sort of bedroom Elizabethan mansion, absolutely wonderful place. But the money had run out decades before I was born. So as I said, we ran a tea room and everybody, and so lots of people used to come. And we never considered ourselves responsible for her literary legacy in the way that, as I said, because that's actually very well looked after by Jane Austen's house, which is obviously 400 metres, away from Chawton House. And
actually, let's stop there, because we can't assume people know the layout of Chawton here. So would you like to, in the same way as we got a sense of where Meryton is compared to where the Bennets live, should we have a little walk around the village? So if we come into the village, what do we see?
So if you come into the village from Alton, which is the closest town, and let's just, if it's not a long walk between the two, that's probably a 15-minute walk. So if you come in from Alton, you come in through Chawton Village, and you have the Grey Friar, the pub on the left, which is 16th century. And then on the right, you've got what is now Jane Austen's house. That is actually, I mean, we call it a cottage. It was Chawton Cottage, but it was a 6-bedroom, yes, detached, very, very nice house. The road actually then sweeps round to the right and sort of goes elsewhere. But if you carry on going, because you can take a road straight on as well, about 5 minutes walk up there. So it's 400 metres from the cottage where Jane lived in the middle of the village. So she would have had an excellent view of the comings and goings and people sort of walking past. But if you carry on going straight, then you come to, as I said, about 400 meters away, you come to a driveway on the left-hand side, which is a beautiful sort of goes down and then up again, up to the house, up to Chawton House. And it's now it's a, you know, as I said, it's a lovely gravel driveway. And as you go up the driveway, you've got the stable block, as it originally was on the left-hand side, and you've got the church, sorry, on the left, and you've got the church on the right, and then you go up to Chawton House, which, as we said, was obviously owned by her brother, and you know, the manor house of the area. It's all surrounded by green fields, and there's a cricket pitch, and there's, you know, exactly what you'd expect. Chawton is absolutely a quintessential English village. It's exactly what you would expect, I think, if you were to imagine, you know, where Jane would have lived.
So if the literary legacy is being sort of managed by the Jane Austen House, what are you doing?
And the academics. I mean, of course, there are an awful lot of academics in the world. Very good work, of course.
Yeah.
But of course, of members of her family, that, you know, there are other things that you want to be, you know, that you want to honour about her legacy. And I don't think any of us would purport ourselves to be, you know, on the literary side of it, as capable as Jane Austen's house and the experts in the world. So, you know, we were always very careful, obviously, about just general behaviour, you know, behaving ourselves, not embarrassing, you know, the family name. We actually lost Chawton. When I say lost, we had to leave Chawton. It could no longer be a family home in 1988. My grandfather died in 1987. When I was 17, and unfortunately, and I'd always known that when he went, I mean, there was no secret that when he died, that we just wouldn't be able to carry on with it as a family home. And at that time, so I was 18 when we left, and I found that really heartbreaking, absolutely heartbreaking to lose Chawton, which it's not really the bricks and mortar at all. It's, you know, when you grow up in 17 generations of your own history, you know, with all of those squires on the wall, with everything you can see sort of having been put there by a member of your family, the sense of belonging is really strong. And my sense of who I was absolutely wrapped up in Chawton. I mean, you know, to me, I was Caroline Jane Knight from Chawton House, and I had never sort of really thought about myself beyond that. So it was a difficult thing for me personally to leave, as it was for all of us. And I sort of strode off ardently in the opposite direction, sort of saying, you know, I'm never going back there, and I just can't have anything to do with this, because it was just painful. And of course, leaving, we had to leave Jane behind. You know, that actually, for me, that was the point at which we had to give her away, and she wasn't actually ours anymore, because we weren't there to be part of the preservation of that legacy. And when I was a child, I mean, Jane was obviously world famous, and obviously, you know, but we lived there pre-Colin Firth. You know, pre that 95, and you literally can, I mean, there is a pre and post Colin Firth era in Jane's popularity and what her legacy kind of means in how she's enjoyed in the world. And I didn't tell anybody for 25 years that I had this connection, that I had grown up in Chawton. I was absolutely determined to be independently successful. And I was determined that I was never, ever, ever going to have to leave a home again if I didn't want to. You know, that was my determination, that I was going to be master of my own destiny, and that would never happen to me again. And thankfully, I've, you know, that's worked very well, and I've got a business and all you know, and my life's worked out. But then, sort of 10 years ago, around the 200-year anniversary of the publishing of Pride and Prejudice, that just changed everything. And by this point, I was living in Australia. And one of the things I loved about Australia when I got there is there was no mention of Jane Austen. 10 years ago, I've been there for 16 years. And for the first 6 years, I never, ever heard her name. And of course, this was not an anti-Jane Austen. I love Jane. This was just, it was painful. And I didn't want to be reminded of what we'd lost. And but then that 200-year anniversary, all of a sudden, you know, the television was crammed full of Austen-related sort of programmes. Every sort of museum in Melbourne was having, you know, something to do with Austen. And then, can you believe it, a Jane Austen tea room opened a couple of kilometres away from me, you know, not far at all in Melbourne. And I sort of suddenly had this real sense of, I mean, I don't know if I believe in such things, but it sort of felt like, in a way, you know, something was calling me. That's what it felt like, was that something was saying, you know, it's two things. First of all, it was time that I emotionally came to terms with what had happened. I mean, I was in my early 40s by this point and really needed to, you know, get over it, actually, and actually make peace with it all, and not hide, and be able to come back to Chawton and be able to talk about it without it being, you know, without crying. And also I had become, you know, over that anniversary of Pride and Prejudice, I just became so aware of, she's become a global phenomenon.
I think you're right, Caroline. She's actually bigger now than she's ever been, and
huge in comparison. I mean, she was always very popular, but the volume of events didn't go on then that happen around the world. This fandom that there is. I mean, obviously, you know, people that came to Chawton when we were young read her text. Simple as that. You know, it's the way you knew her.
It's probably reading. Also, I mean, we've got to mention that terrible word social media here, haven't we? So
absolutely.
So if you go on the sort of online fan sites, there's quite a lot of people who are accessing it via the film versions.
I've done a lot of events. I mean, I've probably spoken 120 different events, and I think, because I always talk to people afterwards, I like, you know, that sort of interaction, and I think that 50% of the people I meet started with a movie, with absolutely,
it's the gateway,
came in that way. So as I'm sort of really realizing how big that, you know, she has become, I just thought in that time, actually now is my opportunity to do something to support her legacy. And I hope, you know, I'm pretty sure she wouldn't mind that I'm unashamedly using her name to raise money for literacy and run literacy programs and do things like that. But I hope that I'm also doing something that is extending her legacy. You know, she is having such a massive impact on the world. I just thought, if we can actually turn that into teaching kids today, you know, in deprived and developing communities, if we can actually turn all of that energy and all of that passion and all of that love for Jane, if we can actually turn that into something that is making a real difference in kids' lives today. And we really do focus on the programs we fund. We really do focus on making the difference between a child not being able to read and being able to read, if you know what I mean. We are working in the most impoverished parts of Delhi in India. You know, we're working with Syrian refugee children in the Lebanon who are not being educated. This is, you know, it's making such a fundamental difference to their lives. And I think Jane would approve. I hope she would. And I think that's, you know, that's my way now of, as I said, yes, trying to add to her legacy.
We'll obviously put a link in the show notes for anyone who wants to donate to that work. So going back to Chawton House, what's happening there today?
So what's happening with Chawton House? So it is now, so after we left, it actually took quite a long time for the family. It is still owned by the family. The freehold is still in family hands, but it's actually on a long lease to the Chawton House Trust. Which is obviously not, you know, not for profit, with a you know, a trust with a board, as you'd expect. And Chawton House is run as a public building. So it actually has a number of different functions. It, of course, attracts Jane Austen fans from around the world who, of course, want to walk the halls that Jane walked, and sit around. You know, I was lucky enough to spend, you know, we ate from the same dining room table as Jane and from the same china, and I used the same family library. And, of course, people want to see those things and take the walk through the garden she most enjoyed. It also attracts, purely because it is a fine example, as I said, of an Elizabethan manor house. It is a fine example. So it, of course, attracts people who enjoy, you know, just a very, very well-preserved historical house and gardens. But it's also the centre of early women's writing from 1600 to 1830. So it actually houses a collection, and I actually asked them the other day for the updated numbers. I think we're on about 16,000 books. I mean, that, you know, the collections are being added to all the time. So it also houses 16,000 books written by women, as I said, from 1600 to 1830. It is the largest collection in the world. So it also attracts, of course, scholars and people who are there to view the books. It's open every day to the public. They also have weddings and things like that. But like any any country house of that sort of magnitude, it costs a lot of money to keep that house open and to keep it running. And so it's not an easy task. And I have to say, hats off to the team who run it. I'm glad it's not me. It is not an easy thing, but to try and marry together, as I said, the costs and everything else. But it is absolutely fantastic to see it, well looked after, being enjoyed by everybody. It's taken me a while to be able to say that. I don't mean I ever, wished it ill, but certainly, certainly.
You had a lot of stuff to work through, Caroline.
Yes, exactly. And when I first started going back there, which was 2014, was the first time I sort of set foot in there. Yes, absolutely. I was in there for 2 hours and then just ran and couldn't go back for another 3 years, because it is weird seeing tourists and visitors sort of, and in 2017, I think it was, or 2018, Chawton House very kindly asked me to, they had some visiting people from America. And they asked me to actually join a lunch they were having, which I accepted. We were having lunch in my parents' bedroom, which has now been turning into a dining room. And not, to begin with, all of that was a bit weird, but it would be for anybody, But now, God, I think it's absolutely fantastic. I love it. I love being up there. And it is great. I mean, it's known around the world, isn't it? I mean, Chawton House is absolutely on the map and known and loved by a lot of people. And now I think that's fantastic.
And we'll obviously also put a link to the summer season at Chawton for anyone who is coming to the UK to visit or who is already here. Caroline, just was thinking that this is probably runs in the family, though, because wasn't Jane in two minds about Bath after her unhappy memories of her father passing away? And of course, she gives the same feelings to Anne Elliot in Persuasion. So I think she would have really sympathized with your need to run away to Australia to overcome a sort of loss, a grieving of a place. We don't talk about people grieving places, but it's a real thing.
It is.
Yeah.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. And I've been to Chawton and I can certainly see why you'd miss it, because it's just beautiful everywhere.
It is magical, isn't it?
It is.
And it is somewhere that I often think, is it just me? Am I just biased? But every time I step into Chawton, there is just, I don't know, something, just a real sense of sort of peace comes over me now.
Yeah, I felt that as well.
Peaceful. And you really can. I mean, I think if you want to get close to Jane, I really think it is the right place to go. You can so imagine her there. You can imagine, yes, you could, there's in the Oak Room, which would have been the ladies' morning room, on upstairs at Chawton House, which is directly over the front door, and there's an alcove in there which Jane used to sit in and write, and you can just so imagine it.
This is the perfect writing spot, because you look out over the drive, you can see people coming and going, but it's private and it's surrounded. It's just, if you don't want to read and write there, what's wrong with you is what I say.
Absolutely. And you can just so imagine her sitting there writing Emma, and there is a family theory, legend, however you want to put it, that Chawton House is Donwell Abbey, or
I can totally see that. Yeah.
And although interestingly enough, because Donwell Abbey has a stone floor in the Great Hall and Chawton House has a wooden floor in the Great Hall, because of course there's a big difference between a house that's a residential house and a house that's open to the public.
Yeah.
So I had as a child absolutely no sense of how much work the house actually needed doing to it. It wasn't crumbling down around us. It didn't feel like that, but it needed a lot of work after we left. And certainly, of course, to turn something into a public building, you've got to have fire escapes. You've got to have all sorts of stuff done. All the panelling had to be fireproofed. Everything had to be done. And when they took up the floor in the Great Hall, there was a message in a bottle under the floor.
Oh, amazing.
From Montague. So this was this would have been right at the end of the 19th century. And the message in the bottle is explaining that they've moved the stone floor from the Great Hall into the inner hall.
How
so
interesting.
When Jane was there, it did have a stone floor.
There you go.
A stone floor. Yes, there you go.
Well, that's amazing. I mean, just to have this extra step of a message in a bottle
yes, I know.
is again adding to the magic.
That's the whole start of a story right there.
Yes.
So, Caroline, I'm going to put you on the spot. Do you have a favourite Jane Austen novel?
I think that there are, yes, but it can change depending on what kind of mood I'm in, if you know what I mean. And I see a lot of, I think as I've got older, I think persuasion.
Yes,
I think a lot of us, as you get older, persuasion. That I think as a younger person it wasn't, because I don't think I was mature enough to get it. And I think as a younger person, I thought persuasion was probably actually the slightly dull one, because kind of not quite as much happens, and But as I've got older myself, I think I really appreciate, and I'm half agony, I'm half hope, there is that is just, I think the most romantic letter. I think that there is just some wonderful writing in that. So I think today I'd say persuasion. I mean, I think when I think there's been times when it's been Pride and Prejudice, although I think Pride and Prejudice is fantastic, but there is a way in which I've probably seen it too much.
Exactly.
To me,
yes,
it's yes, I've probably seen it just a little bit too much. So yes, I'd plump for persuasion now.
That's. I think Katie and I have also agreed on that in the past, haven't we?
Yes, we have.
And what about this is the final cruel question? What about your favourite adaptation into a screen product? I mean, clearly it's going to be The Last Persuasion, isn't it?
Well, I think in terms of, I mean, of course, there are, we're well into over 100 productions now based on, obviously, inspired by Jane's work. And of course, there are things in there that aren't to my taste. But I always think, I mean, first of all, when I sort of decided, I said 10 years ago that I was going to start a literacy foundation and do that, I very, very quickly figured out that if I was going to spend my time getting upset about what's happening with her work, I'd be upset all the time. There is just no point, absolutely no point in sort of, and I work in Melbourne, and in my, in the office I'm in, there's lots of young marketing people are all in their 20s and 30s, and when Pride and Prejudice and Zombies came out, that's something that's not, it's not to my taste particularly, but I realized that there were 3 people in that office who saw it because they're into zombie movies, and it was their first introduction to Jane Austen, and that sparked a conversation, and now they've, and it actually made me really appreciate, it wasn't for me, I'm not the target market of it, I'm not supposed to like it, but also that absolutely every production that's done does appeal to somebody, and it does bring in, and some of those people, that will be the catalyst to them eventually getting to Jane's words, and so I try as much as I can to celebrate all of them that come out. Having said that, I mean, I think that I would absolutely, I know it's an oldie, but it's a goodie. I'd absolutely highlight Emma Thompson's Sense and Sensibility. I really liked that. I thought it just captured, Kate's making a face, so maybe not. But then I also think it's probably because it was one of the first ones I saw. And it's much the same way as people, obviously, lots of people are very, very, there's always the Pride and Prejudice, 95, 2005, wasn't it? That sort of, split. But I think often it's the one you saw first, isn't it? It's the one that cemented in your mind, who Elizabeth Bennet was.
I think my first one adaptation I saw was the 1981 with Elizabeth Garvey, who was a wonderful Lizzie. Yep. And a very wooden.
Yep. David Rintoul.
Mr. Darcy, David Rintoul. Yeah. Who was very handsome, but he was just a bit too reserved for me. But it was for its time, it was a wonderful adaptation, and I really enjoyed it.
Well, I mean, obviously the persuasion from the Amanda Root, Kieran Hines persuasion is clearly, the best.
That's mine and Julia's mark of perfection.
Yes, but I'll give you that.
I do like Sense and Sensibility. I think particularly as a film, the choice of music and actually the cleverness of the way it's been adapted, looking at what's come off the page into the screenplay is really good in the Emma Thompson one. Yeah. But I do love Bride and Prejudice, the Bollywood version.
Oh, I do as well. Doesn't it translate well? Doesn't that? Yeah. I agree. That is really fun and a really good adaptation. And you're right. When I think of Wentworth, I think of Kieran Hines. That is who I've got in my mind. That persuasion, I agree, is very good. is very good.
Excellent. So thank you so much, Caroline, for taking us through the present day life at Chawton. And we will, as I say, put the links for people to follow to see the ongoing work. Coming to the end of today's episode, we always have a little roundup of what's been happening over the last few weeks by choosing our Darcy and Wickham of the week, or you could say Elizabeth and Lady Catherine, if you wish. I mean, you can interpret that how you like. So I don't want to put Caroline first on the spot. Let's go to Katie. Katie, have you got a Darcy to share with us?
Well, I've got a good thing that's happened, which is they found the Book of Hours from Thomas Cromwell. They identified it through what it looked like in a very famous painting of his, and they found the exact book that he had, which of course has been in the library, I think in Cambridgeshire, all the time. So the librarians were probably going, well, what do you mean it's lost? We've had it all the time. Nobody's borrowed it. That's all. But it's a beautiful book, and it's lovely to see it now getting the wider attention it deserves, and the looking after it deserves. So it's nice that they've found it, even if it wasn't that lost. And my Wickham of the week, I think, is Silvio Berlusconi, who has passed away at a ripe old age. And I mention him because he had a lovely quote in his dying years, where he said, well, of course, I model myself a bit on Napoleon. He did achieve a lot, and I haven't achieved quite as much, but I was taller. I think that says a lot about his entire mindset to me. He conquered Europe, but I was taller.
Sounds a bit like a Walter Elliot quote, actually.
Yes, very much so.
Yes.
So my Darcy of the week, I'm probably one of the last in the world to appreciate Ted Lasso. If you want a series, if you haven't got into it yet, if you want a series that is positive without ducking the blows, good about mental health and timely, I would say that's a very good piece they're making. Jason Sudeikis and the writing team, excellent. And sort of my Darcy amongst the crew is Hannah. Is it Waddington or Waddingham? Anyway, yes. I mean, she has emerged recently as this star for her singing, helping present the Eurovision Song Contest. So she's my Darcy. She
was marvellous. I saw her in that.
She seems such a great person.
Yeah.
My Wickham, well, there is a lot of Wickhams around in politics at the moment. We have a kind of farcical Wickham happening in our Partygate scandal thing going on over here, which hopefully, Caroline, you're not spending any time thinking about because it's so totally depressing. But of course, there's the much more serious Wickham-isms going over in a former president being multiply charged. So I'm going to sort of bundle that all up into one and talk about politicians who do things they shouldn't.
And I'm going to.
Yeah, you could probably nominate one of those every week.
And I'm going to highlight Alison Larkin. Alison Larkin is an extremely talented writer, comedian, and the top-selling Austen audiobook narrator. And we do a writing competition every year, the Jane Austen Literary Foundation. And the prize is actually a short story competition, but the 3 winning short stories she records as an audiobook for us and publishes it worldwide. And this year we've just had Jane Austen Regency Week is on right now, which is why I'm here. But we have I host an event, the Jane Austen Picnic, which was on Sunday, and Alison actually came from America for me to come over, and we announced the winner at the competition, and she read it out to the delight of the crowd. So an absolute sterling effort from her, and she's an enormous support to the foundation. And I think in terms of my Wickham, although I know this isn't all news to you, but I haven't really been paying that much attention in Australia. So I've been reading the paper a bit sort of since I've been here. And yes, of course, caught up on all the Partygate stuff. But I have to say that Harry is, as I said, which is probably not news to you, but has obviously, done a fair job of alienating everybody. So, as I said, I've been catching up on a bit of that. So I'd probably pick Harry, I guess, as the.
I think a lot of people would be saying, "Who do you think you are?" at this point.
Yeah. No, I mean, I think with Harry, there's always going to be the other side of the story, seeing it from his point of view. You know, he didn't ask to be born in that role, but I
think it's something that I think that's absolutely true. He didn't ask to be born in that role. I do, however, think that if we wanted to, we've all got things that we could moan about. We've all got things that we could, you know, I've got things that I could absolutely be very cross with my family about. You know, I didn't, of course, it's not in the same, I'm not in any way aligning with Harry in any way at all. But I didn't ask to be born into a family that had a, you know, that had tourists in our house every year, you know, and I had, you know, a childhood of being affectionately but touched by Americans, and you know that was you know, and there are things, but so I don't necessarily, I have sympathy with his situation, but certainly, and of course I'm going on what the press are saying here, but certainly some of the things I've read about perhaps the way he has managed that,
yes, I think he's not been a good brother.
And yes, so I'm not, as I said, I'm not actually taking an opinion on whether or not he has a right to be aggrieved or to feel, you know, that certain things, and certainly there was some stuff that's come out recently, of course, about what the reality was like for him of the press intrusion. And I don't think anybody can help but having some sense of sympathy towards that. I'm just talking about the way perhaps that he's handled some of it.
And that's where Wickham can be quite helpful, because obviously there's also the backstory of Wickham, of the child who's sort of favoured and but yet isn't the favoured one. So you know, there are some correlations there.
Stories about that. Yes. His story, somebody else's story, and the truth lies in between.
Yes, absolutely. And my father's the second son, so his elder brother inherited. And that's that comes with its complications, but you know, my father accepts that and actually has done a very, very good job of making, because actually there's advantages to not being the eldest. You know, there are advantages to not having that sort of responsibility on your shoulders and knowing you've got it from birth.
No, it's a lot of pressure.
It's a lot of pressure. So I think that all of us just have to make the best, don't we? We have to, you know, you have to focus on what the positives are. And as I said, from what I can see, Harry seems to be a little bit stuck in the negative.
Yes.
Yeah.
Well, I hope he is happy. So
absolutely.
So finally, do we have any Jane Austen news to draw our listeners' attention to? Any upcoming events or books or anything of that nature? Katie, you were telling me.
Yes, I was just saying that. Well, obviously the Jane Austen Festival is coming up in September, and I'm thinking ahead already, because when I went to purchase my tickets for various events going on, I think one ball right at the start of the week, the tickets have sold out within 21 minutes of going online.
Oh, gracious.
So if you're thinking of attending any events at the Jane Austen Festival in September,
hurry up.
Look at the festival programme and don't leave it too long for the events you want to go to, because they're selling like hotcakes at the moment. But there are some free events as well, so you should be able to join in on those.
And on that kind of what's happening in Bath line, is that one of my passions is the story of Caroline Herschel, who is a contemporary to Jane Austen. And one of the things I've been writing over the years is a play about her, an 8-hander. We're doing a stage reading at the Mission Theatre, Bath, with professional actors and someone playing the harpsichord, because the Herschels were musicians as well as very famous astronomers. William Herschel is the man who discovered Uranus, which is the first time in modern era that a planet was discovered. So big change. Anyway, his sister Caroline is a fantastic early woman in science, the first professional female scientist. And I want the world to know her story, but also make them laugh. So please come along on the 6th of October to the Mission Theatre, Bath, for an excellent evening of music and science and drama. And I'll put a link in the show notes for you to get a ticket for that. But also slightly extending the definition of Jane Austen news, Katie has been our canary in the coal mine, and she has watched the Queen
Charlotte, a Bridgerton story.
Yeah, the spin-off. Is it worth our time if we haven't got to it yet?
I would say yes, if you like a good dramatic it's very much, I tend to think of this like Victorian melodramas. It's got, love, passion, drama, lots of wonderful costumes, people emoting all over the place, and just a pinch, just a soupçon of historical detail. Nothing to sort of get in the way of facts. But I enjoy it like a big box of chocolates that it is, and I think it had a small demur at the start that said this is based on history, but it's not, necessarily. The facts may be somewhat a departure, shall we say, from historical fact. So it's a good romp. It's good fun. It's a very touching love story. Lots of people have been crying at the end and things like that. It's got a very nice cast, a very pretty cast. For the most part, and some yes, I think it's good fun. It's good entertainment. It's definite escapism. So if that's your bag, enjoy it. But if you're going to shout at the TV every time a historical misstep is made, it's not for you.
Unless you enjoy that.
Unless you enjoy that, yes. If that's your bag as well, have at it.
Yeah.
And Caroline, is there anything you'd like to draw our attention to? Any appeals, for example?
Well, I mean, the foundation, we're at the moment our charity of the year, because we run ourselves a lot of online literacy activities and the writing competition of various things, but the actual programs that we support financially, we don't run ourselves. We find, very good work going on around the world, and we support it. So at the moment, we're raising money for Schools for Syria, which I mentioned before, as I said, that teach refugee children in the Lebanon. And we have a program of other activities that are coming up in the year that people will obviously be able to see on our website at janeaustenlf.org. But actually, in terms of the future, one of the most exciting things that has just happened is I received a phone call at the end of last year from an Australian collector. I mean, I could only assume she's the biggest collector. I can't imagine that anyone would have more of period fashion. And she's called Fiona Baverstock, and her husband have spent their lifetime together. She's now in her 80s, collecting vintage fashion from 1750 to 1950. Keith sadly died 18 months, 2 years ago. And I had actually met them before in 2018 because they were exhibiting the early part of their collection in Melbourne, and they had curated it as an Austen exhibition, so that all of the mannequins are dressed as Austen characters. And so I'd met them then, but then hadn't heard anything from them since. And to cut a long story short, Fiona has decided, and she has gifted me her collection from 1750 to 1880, which is a collection of more than 200 pieces, which it obviously is a fantastic. I mean, so I'm intending to exhibit that around the world. So in Australia, here in the UK and America, because it is an absolutely phenomenal collection of fashion, all for charity. Every bit of profit will go to charity, and that will support the Jane Austen Literary Foundation and Chawton House. So it's a little bit further away, because those exhibitions of that size, places are planning years in advance. But certainly in terms of something that will be coming up in the future, I've obviously called it the Baverstock Collection after Keith and Fiona Baverstock have put it together. But certainly, if you, it may be a couple of years, but when you see the Baverstock Collection coming your way, it really is worth a look. There's some fascinating things, and I've got some baby stays.
Oh, wow.
There's things in there that you just think I
can't wait to see this, Caroline.
It's honestly, it is exquisite. It is so exciting. So it will take a while, but absolutely, when the Baverstock collection comes, have a look.
Well, on that note of that great news, and keep us informed, because we'll obviously publicise that when it gets going on its world tour. But that's fantastic. Thank you so much for sharing that with us. So that completes our programme today. So thank you very much for listening. And thank you to Caroline for joining us.
Thanks, Caroline.
Nice to talk to you.